So this week we're going to start with Hosea. And so Hosea, quite an interesting book. So note that whereas Amos, if you'll remember, Amos was focused more on social issues, right? Now we clearly know that that idolatry is a problem with the Old Testament Israelites. But Amos, that just wasn't the focus. The focus was more on social issues. However, Hosea focuses more on idolatry and not trusting in Yahweh for salvation. And when we talk about for salvation, we mean salvation from other people and things like that, like protection. Think of the word protection. Note that idolatry is throughout, but also the text brings up the idea of, which is also in Kings, the idea of putting faith in either Egypt or Assyria for protection as opposed to Yahweh, right? And so what happens is, let's say I'm Judah, right? And so what'll happen is I'm right in the middle of two major world empires, right? And so for the Assyrians to come down and go to Egypt, they're going to have to come through me in Judah. And for the Egyptians to get up and get at the Assyrians, they're going to have to come through me to do that, right? And so let's say the Egyptians are coming up and they're going to try to attack, and I'm going to lose because it's Egypt, right? So what I'm going to do then, if I'm some of these kings, I'm going to get with Assyria and say, hey, listen, I'll pay you guys tribute. I'll be one of your client kingdoms if you'll just help me with the Egyptians, right? And then that's mutually beneficial for Assyria because they need to be able to use my land to get through, right? And so you have this struggle back and forth where you have both Israel and Judah putting their faith in other kingdoms because they're right there in front of them, right? Like but it's frowned on, right? Not good. Again, of course, they would have to pay tribute. The tribute system is simply, you pay us, stuff. So in Hosea, you have chapters 1 through 3, which set up this metaphor concerning Hosea and his wife Gomer versus Yahweh and Israel, right? So it's a parallel deal, a metaphor. If you'll remember, a metaphor is a comparison that does not use like or as, and then a simile is a comparison that does use like or as, right? So let's say that my wife, Wendy, walks through the door, and I say, oh, a rose, beautiful and sweet smelling, right? So clearly, my wife is not an actual rose, right? And so, but I'm using a metaphor, right? I just start describing her as though she's a rose, right? But if I say, wow, you look like a rose, right? In that case, it's not a metaphor, it's a simile, because I'm just saying you look like this, or you are as a whatever, then you're using a simile. That's the difference between a metaphor and a simile. A metaphor is when you just come out and make the comparison. A simile is when you say you are like this other thing, or you are as this other thing, right? And so this whole Hosea-Gomer relationship is a metaphor for the relationship between Yahweh and Israel, right? Then chapters 4 through 14 flesh out the unfaithfulness of Israel. So chapters 1 through 3 say basically Israel is like this relationship where Hosea is married to this prostitute, and then from 4 on, it's like, okay, this is why I say that, right? The Bible or the book. Okay, so Hosea and Gomer it's a performance metaphor, right? Because poor Hosea, right? So his whole relationship is to point out how bad the relationship is between Yahweh and Israel. And so that's his job, is to marry this woman who they're going to play out this relationship so that it's right there visible for everyone to see, okay? Not good for poor Hosea. Note, as in the case of Isaiah, the children's names are signs, right? And so, and it's for Israel and the coming of Assyria, and Judah and the coming of Assyria. Also note that the relationship between Hosea and Gomer Oh, is a metaphor. I already said that. Is a metaphor between Yahweh and Israel. So let's look starting at 1:2. So it says, this is Hosea 1:2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord, right? And just in case you didn't get it, it repeats it several times, right? So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son, right? So it would seem that son is his, right? So it says bore him a son. So we think probably that's actually his son. Keeping on at 4. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And this seems to be from previous battles and things that happened, that they're being punished, the house of Jehu, basically his family. And on that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. She conceived again and bore a daughter. Notice it says she conceived again and bore a daughter. It does not say that she bore him a daughter. So now it seems that he's not the father, right? She brought up like several 80s trashy TV shows, right? You are not the father, right? And so that's what he got. She conceived again and bore the daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, right? That's a name. For I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. So again, note that the name is a sign that, listen, it's done. It's over with, right? And note, so in the metaphor itself, so note that we don't know who the father is, just like Israel, they don't know who their father is, right? Because they don't trust in God. And so we don't know who this No Mercy's father is, and Israel doesn't know their father either. And so that's the metaphor. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war horse or horses or by horsemen. So this is going to be, so note that Assyria is supposed to come down and destroy Judah. However, because of Hezekiah, which we will get a little bit of at the end of this week, right? And when you get to Saturday, then you'll get into Hezekiah, right? And so he's a good guy, right? He does many good things. And we'll talk about that at the end. When she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son, right? So note, she conceived and bore a son. So again, this doesn't seem as though he's the father again. And the Lord said, call his name Not My People, for you are not my people, and I am not your God, right? And so note, in Hebrew, these names are a lot more interesting. They don't seem like they're, like these things, right? Not my people would be a weird name, but if it's like Halabajabad or something, then it might make more sense. I have no idea what the Hebrew word is. All right. Do what? Is that it, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Is it in your Bibles? Oh, Zoami, is that it? Loami? Oh, gotcha. Very good. But note, with all of this, there's still hope for the future. And so at 110 through 2:1, you get that. It says at 110, starting at 110, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy, right? And so, despite the judgment that's coming, you always have the promise of the future that things will get better, things will come together. And listen, if you're an ancient Israelite, what you're going to see is we're going to come back from exile, right? And so, and then when they come back from exile, they would say, hey, that's fulfilled, right? However, you could still look and say, but the ultimate fulfillment is going to be a day when, when all of our worries and troubles are over, we don't have to worry about that type of judgment ever again. And, we live in this earth, the new heavens and the new earth come together. Obviously, that would be the ultimate fulfillment of this. But certainly the ancient Israelites would have seen the fulfillment as when they come back from exile, ultimately under Persia. All right, so we're going to look at another example of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, right? Because Hosea, there's a 11:1 is used in the New Testament at Matthew 2:13 through 15. And so we're going to look and see how that's used. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. All right, so let's look first at Matthew 2:13 through 15. Goodness. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child." Now, this is after the wise men leave, and Herod is going to come after Jesus, right? Because he's the king that's to be born, and so he's going to come after them. So he gets a dream. Joseph gets a dream. "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Right? So you look at that and you say, okay, well, which prophet, right? Well, spoiler alert, it's Hosea. Note that this is a direct quote of Hosea 11:1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Right? And so now, in that context, we're clearly talking about Israel, the nation, being called out of Egypt. Right? And so you get Jesus, you could argue at this point, as the perfect Israel coming out of Egypt, right? Different circumstance, but you say, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, then you look at the whole context of the Hosea passage. Note Hosea 11:1 through 3. It says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I had healed them." Right? So then you say, so how does that work? How does the New Testament author, how does Matthew use that to look back at the Old Testament and use that to refer to Jesus? What's up with that? And it's going to kind of be the same deal when we talked about Jesus on the cross, and we talked about, my God, why have you forsaken me? We talked about that refers to a psalm, and you have to understand the entire context of that psalm before you understand why he said that. Again, you had the salvation coming at the end of the psalm, and he would have had that in his mind. Similar thing here. The passage has to be read in light of the hope, again, that comes after the coming exile, culminating in verse 11 of Hosea 11:11. So it's 11:11. "They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, declares the Lord." Right? So what does that mean? So Matthew, quoting only the first verse, would have the entire passage in mind. Okay? And that's probably clear as mud at this point, but I'm going to explain, and there's going to be a lot of information. Because listen, the New Testament authors were entrenched in what we call the Old Testament. That was their Bible, right? And I'm sure they had a lot of things to take their minds off of reading the Bible and stuff, but they didn't have Netflix and all the millions of distractions that we have today, right? So they knew, right? They knew their Bibles, and so sometimes when they use passages in the Old Testament, you kind of have to get at what they were thinking, right? And so we're going to get at what they were thinking. I'm going to give you the basic deal, and then we're going to talk a little more about it. So you've got Jesus here is viewed as the new Moses, leading his people in a new Exodus, right? So you've got the new Moses in Jesus leading people in a new Exodus. Between the passages in Hosea and Matthew, we're referring to three Exoduses, okay? You've got the Exodus of the book of Exodus, right? You have the Exodus that's going to be coming for Hosea's time in the somewhat near future, where they will all return from exile out of Assyria and Babylon, right? So you have that Exodus, which Hosea is near talking about. And then you have the Exodus from sin and death, which Jesus will lead his people from, right? And so that's your three Exoduses that we're looking at. Those three are being chained together in Matthew. That's the thought process that he's thinking. Hosea is chaining with the Exodus, and then Matthew is then going back to Hosea, which is referring to the Exodus. To understand this, you need to understand a couple of passages in Josephus, right? Josephus, who is an ancient historian. He lived, he was a Jewish guy, and he lived from 37 to 100 AD, right? So he lived right after the crucifixion of Jesus through most of the New Testament time, past that. And then he died right at the end of the New Testament period, right? Now, interestingly, Josephus is famous because he is considered an extra biblical account of Jesus, right? Which is interesting because one of the accounts is probably not real, right? So there's a point in Josephus. He wrote several histories, right? So he wrote Antiquities of the Jews, the Jewish Wars. So he's got different books that he wrote. And in one of them, he writes about Jesus. And he says he was a good man, all these things. And then he says, surely he was God, right? Now, that would be a pretty specific, like, wow. But Josephus never really talks about Jesus or Christianity ever in any other place. He is I won't say he's a good Jew, but he was staunchly Jewish, right? And so it seems out of character. So what happened is later on down the line, somebody added that line in Josephus, right? But what's interesting is what that did was it made it sure that Josephus's writings would survive till this day, because that passage was in there and people were like, hey, this is important. So we kept it, right? And so now here it is today. And so why is it important? If that line's not real, why is it important? Well, because he tells us more about the Herods than anywhere else, right? You can read all about the Herods in Josephus. He talks about John the Baptist. He talks about that whole story with Herod and John the Baptist and the relationship with his wife, and that was his brother Philip's wife, and all of that. He gives you all the backstory behind that. And then there's a passage, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a passage where he talks about James. And that passage seems to be authentic as well. So you do have a lot of background that he provides, particularly about the Jewish people, but about the Herods, lots about the Herods. Again, he mentions John the Baptist and other things that are related to the Bible. So Josephus relates about Moses because, again, he's a Jewish guy, right? So he tells stories and stuff about Judaism. And so he tells a story about Moses, which was obviously circulating during Jesus' day because he lived during that time. And it says this. He says, while they were in these circumstances, and again, he's talking back about Moses, the following additional cause spurred on the Egyptians the more to eradicate our race, talking about the Israelites. A certain one of the sacred scribes, for they are skilled in their ability to predict the future accurately, announced to the king, which would be the Pharaoh, that someone would be begotten at that time to the Israelites who would humble the rule of the Egyptians and would elevate the Israelites. And having been reared, he would surpass all men in virtue and acquire a reputation held in everlasting memory. He's talking about Moses, right? So they go to the king, Pharaoh, and they say, hey, there's this guy, he's going to be born, and he's going to be awesome, and he's going to make us look bad, right? And so what we're going to get is we're going to get this is going to kind of explain backstory. Now listen, this doesn't mean that this is true historically, right? We don't know that this is true, but it's a story going around during Jesus' day that people are familiar with. Alarmed, the king, in accordance with the opinion of that man, the scribe, who told him that this person was going to be born, ordered that every male fathered by the Israelites should be cast into the river and destroyed. and that the midwives of the Egyptians should watch carefully the pangs of childbirth of the Hebrew women, and should observe closely their deliveries. So then it goes on. And after Amram, who was the father of Moses, prays to God for help after the decree to kill the children, God tells him of what Moses will become. And he says, "Now know that I am looking after your common welfare and your frame. For this child, because of whose birth the Egyptians in their fear have condemned those born from Israelites to perish, will be yours. And he shall escape notice of those who are on guard for his destruction. And nurtured in a surprising way, he shall deliver the race of the Hebrews from their distress among the Egyptians. And he shall be remembered as long as the universe shall endure, not only among Hebrew men, but also among foreigners, since I bestow this favor upon you and those who will be descended from you. And he shall have such a brother as to hold my priesthood, both he and his descendants, for all time." Right? So when we look at the story about Moses, which again is not, it's as far as we know, it's a fictional story. It would be tradition passed down by the Jews about Moses, right? So it's not necessarily a historical story, but it is a story going on about Moses during the time of Jesus. And note that Jesus' birth and all of that mirrors it very much. It sounds a lot like that story. And so what we're saying here is that people in the day would have made the connection between Jesus and this story about Moses, which fills out more of the idea of Jesus being the new Moses than what we just get out of the Old Testament itself, right? So Jesus as the new Moses, notice, would fulfill Deuteronomy 18:15, which we've talked about before. It says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." So note that once we get to Jesus' day, the Jewish people were looking for two figures. They were looking for the Messiah, who would be a king, who would kick out whatever worldly power is over the Jews at the time. And they're still looking for a prophet like Moses from Deuteronomy 18:15. The disciples see the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18:15, that prophet like Moses, early on. Notice that John 1:45 says, "Philip found Nathanael and said to him, 'We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph.'" Note, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and wrote," right? That first part, that would be the prophet of Deuteronomy 18:15. So they're like, "Hey, we found the prophet," right? And then the prophets wrote about the Messiah, right? The author of Hebrews, though, makes it clear that Jesus surpasses Moses. So you have this whole idea in early Christianity, in the earliest church, where Jesus is the new Moses. But the author of Hebrews goes out of his way to make it clear that even though there is certainly that comparison, Jesus is greater than Moses, right? And so at Hebrews 3, and it's throughout the New Testament, but specifically, you've got a good example here. Hebrews 3, 1-6 says, "Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope." So you've got Jesus as the new Moses because he's leading an exodus from death and sin, right? However, Hebrews author is making it clear, make sure you don't get it misunderstand, Jesus is more important than Moses is, right? Whereas Moses was just a messenger, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this. So now, with all that background, back to Hosea. At 11:1 again, it says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So verse 1 speaks of calling the Israelites out of Egypt, right? And though it then follows up with Israel's disobedience, it eventually looks to the future salvation when the Israelites will return after the new Assyrian exile. You get to 11:11, they shall come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will return them to their homes, declared the Lord. All right, so to kind of break it back down and go back over the high points. Note, interestingly, that Israel/Jacob, the person, and Jesus both go to Egypt under a Joseph, right? So that's kind of interesting. Both Moses and Jesus are similarly threatened with death as children are targeted in their respective time periods, with the story from Josephus creating even more parallels between their two stories. Jesus will lead Israel in a new exodus and save them from exile, though that exile is a spiritual exile where he is saving them from sin and spiritual death, right? Obviously, Jesus is not saving people from literal death. He's saving them from spiritual death. So that's what all of that is kind of dealing with. So when you get to Matthew and you read back on that, yes, he quotes that little verse there, but it says so much more than what you just we look at it in Matthew and say, I wonder where that came from. And your little Bible will have a little note, and you'll be like, look back and be like, oh, Hosea 11:1. And you'll read that one verse, and you're like, oh yeah, that does sound like that. And then you go back, to read Matthew, right? There's a whole lot to it, and to understand it fully, you have to understand that background context. Okay, one of the be-all, end-all events in the Old Testament period, both for Israel and Judah, eventually, here you have the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And so that's at 2 Kings 18. We're going to start at 9. The fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. It says, in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hosea, son of Elah, king of Israel. Notice that Hezekiah is in the south, right? So we're talking about, we always talk about them in accordance with when the other king is ruling as well. And it helps us put out a timeline to figure out when these things are happening, right? Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And again, Samaria is just Israel, right? It's the northern kingdom of Israel. And at the end of 3 years, he took it. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hosea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria and put them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So note, they are exiled and sent to all other places. But they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God. Because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. They neither listened nor obeyed. Then, not only that, you have foreigners are going to be imported into the land of Israel, right? So that's at 2 Kings 17, 24 through 25. It says, and the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. Okay, so then you've got the story afterwards where they send a priest, and the priest kind of gets them on board a little bit, but they still worship other gods and do all of that. Now, why is this part important? Note that you've got Judah. We've been reading about all this time where Judah and Israel are fighting each other, right? Assyria comes in, takes out the northern kingdom, takes the upper classes and lots of people and exiles them. Why do we exile people, right? Why would we want to send them out of their land? Well, because it prevents them from getting together and fighting back. If we send them all over the world, then they can't gather and fight back, right? And so it's a political strategy. Then, because we're doing that all over the world as well, right? So we're sending other people all over the empire. So we send these other people from all these other places, pagans, into the northern kingdom of Israel, or that area. And this will be the deal, right? So there's still Jewish people who live there, usually lower classes and people like that. So then those people will start intermingling, right? Once you get to the time of Jesus, that's the Samaritans, right? Still Samaria, right? That's the Samaritans that you come across in the New Testament. And when we tell the parable of the Good Samaritan, right, we always think of a Good Samaritan, that's a great person, right? No, in the New Testament, there's no such thing as a Good Samaritan. Those people are evil, right? And so when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you've got the good Jewish guy that's been, waylaid on the side of the road, you've got a priest that comes by and he doesn't want to be bothered, you've got a Levite who comes by, they don't want to be bothered, and then suddenly you've got the Samaritan, and they're like, no, there's no way that he's about to say that a Samaritan is our neighbor, because that's the whole point of the parable. Who is my neighbor, right? Because he says you've got to love your neighbor as yourself. Who's my neighbor? And he says, well, the priest didn't end up being his neighbor. The Levite didn't end up being his neighbor. It was the Samaritan, the hated Samaritan. I mean, it would be like, and it would be this, because again, he's making a point, right? It would be like if I said to you, you have been in a car wreck, right? And you are off in a ditch on the side of the road. And, the preacher comes by and looks off and says, oh, no, I don't want to get blood on me. And he goes on by. And then your Sunday school teacher, he stops and he looks and he says, oh, I don't want to be bothered. And then a radical terrorist comes by and sees you there and gets out and helps you, pays for your hospital bills, pays for your, place to live and all of that. That's how Jesus's audience would have seen it. It would have been that crazy for them. And again, the reason that he says that is because when the lawyer asks him, because the point is, what's the most important commandment? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so then the lawyer, he asks him, well, who is my neighbor? Not because he wants to say, who are all the people that I get to love? No. What are the smallest amount of people that I have to love to fill this, right? Like I love my family. Well, most of them, right? I love some of the people at my church, I like a lot of the people that I work with. Now, obviously, I'm joking. This is not real stuff, right? But in other words, that's the mindset of the lawyer, is he's like going through trying to lessen the amount of people. And so Jesus gives him the most crazy example. That guy's your neighbor. You have to love that person, right? Doesn't mean you have to, justify what they do or give into what they do. But it's just saying, it's basically saying all people are your neighbor. You have to love everyone, right? That's the Samaritans, right? And so this is the start of all that, right? Is right here when we get the Assyrians coming in and sending them out. That's it, right? Okay, I thought it was interesting at Isaiah 5, 1 through 7. You have a parable about Israel and Judah. And it sounds very similar to a parable that Jesus would tell. Isaiah 5, 1 through 7, it says, let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill, right? So again, notice you have vineyards and such because that's, that's what they're familiar with, right? So that's why you get a lot of that farming, language and stuff. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes, right? So again, we're talking about the Israelites and Judah and all of that. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes, right? So again, this is the Israelites. And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry, right? So it's a similar, it kind of has a Jesus parable flavor to me in my mind, and I just thought that was interesting. But again, obviously it's a parable about Israel, and Judah's in there. And again, this would be a parable using metaphor, right? Where it compares Israel and Judah to these, vineyards and all of that. Okay. Remember when we talked about the law is providing examples of what good judgments look like, right? So this is one of those things I'm going to repeat every time it comes up. We also noted that the covenant with Yahweh stipulated both covenant blessings and covenant curses, right? And we said if you follow the covenant, you will get these blessings, and if you don't follow the covenant, you get these curses, right? Well, we're well into the curses at this point, right? We're experiencing the curses. Note that we said that God is glorified either way, right? Because if the Israelites follow the covenant, then he blesses them, and people look and say, man, look at the blessing of the people of God. But if they don't follow the covenant and he judges them, then the people around look and say, look, the God of Israel judges his people when they don't act righteously, right? He has high expectations for his people. So either way, Yahweh is glorified in the covenant and how Israel follows the covenant. So at Isaiah 5:16, it says, but the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. That is a direct statement of that. In other words, he is exalted in justice. So you might look and say, well, wait a minute, the Israelites, they've just all fallen apart, and now they're going to be exiled, by the Assyrians, and well, man, God must be really, he must look bad right now. He's got, egg on his face, as we might say, right? No, God is glorified in that as well. God is exalted in that because he has high expectations for his people. And when they don't act the way he expects, he judges them. And that's a good thing. Again, I use the example of people's children, right? We all look at people's children and we look at how they act. And now listen, sometimes children just aren't going to do whatever. And I don't mean that, obviously. But in other words, some people have kids that they have high expectations for, and some people have kids that they don't seem to have as high expectations for, right? And that's just, that's just the way it seems. And we judge that, right? We look and we say, look, that child acts very well, or whatever. Or that child is not acting well, and the parent just, judged them, right? Or punished them. Oh, look at that, right? That parent has high expectations, right? Now, just for the record, just because you punish your children doesn't mean they're always going to do the right thing, right?
That's for sure.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I am not implying that at all, okay? As though I'm the model parent, No. So again, so another thing that we've repeated over and over, and along those same lines, is that the Lord sends judgment in the form of foreign nations, right? And so we get at Isaiah 13, 4-6, it says, the sound of a tumult is on the mountains as of a great multitude. The sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land and the end of the heavens, the Lord, from the end of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Well, for the day of the Lord is near, as destruction from the Almighty it will come. So note, he is referring to the Assyrians coming. And he is referring to them as his army because he's allowing them to come in and to defeat, specifically at this point, Israel. And it talks about the day of the Lord. And so the day of the Lord is an important theme throughout the Old Testament, right? And it into the New Testament a little bit, particularly in the book of Revelation. It reuses that language again to its ultimate fulfillment. Because the day of the Lord means two things, depending on the context. The day of the Lord, in every context, means judgment from God, right? And so in this case, the day of the Lord is the Assyrians coming in and judging the Israelites for their sins, right? And God is using them to do that, okay? However, the ultimate day of the Lord that you get in other places, and particularly in the book of Revelation, is going to be in final judgment, right? So the ultimate day of the Lord is going to be in final judgment, right? All right. Then you have, which we've done this already, but we still have 15 minutes left, and so we're going to go through it again. And I'm still going to maintain my same argument, even though sometimes I don't know. I don't know. So, yeah, sometimes I flounder a little bit, but I'm not floundering. All right, so Isaiah 14, 3 through 23, if you read the whole context. Again, if you were just to read 14, 12 through 14, you would get this. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. Or, if you have a King James or a New King James, it says Lucifer, son of the dawn. How you were cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, right? Specifically, if you have a King James version or a New King James, you say that this is talking about Satan, right? You say this is Satan, okay? So let's go back and start reading from Isaiah 14:3. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt song against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. Who is the oppressor? The king of Babylon. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows. Who struck the people in wrath with unceasing blows? King of Babylon. That ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution, the king of Babylon. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing because the king of Babylon is gone, or will be. The cypresses rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us, the king of Babylon. Sheol beneath, which is the underworld, is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. So all the other kings are in the underworld. Now finally this king of Babylon is coming down with them, right? And he'll be there as well. All of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Because the king of Babylon was so spectacular, we're shocked that he's now with us, right? All of this is metaphorical, right? Or whatever, figurative. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. The sound of your harps, maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you were cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Who did all that? The king of Babylon, right? So again, why do we think this is about Satan? Well, because it talks about a fall, and it talks about somebody who wanted to be above God, right? And so, and then again, the King James Version has Lucifer. Well, Lucifer is the Latin word for day star. And the day star is Venus, right? And so the point here is that the king of Babylon thinks that he's Venus, right? And he's raising himself up above Yahweh, right? He said, you thought you were better than the God of Israel, right? Well, spoiler alert, you're not, right? You're going to end up rotting with every other person. So why does the King James have Lucifer? Well, since Lucifer is the Latin word for day star, and the King James translators used all the texts that they had, which were not many, to translate the Old Testament into English. One of the texts that they used was the Latin Vulgate, right? And the Latin Vulgate was what the Catholic Church had used. It was translated in the 300s AD by Jerome, right? And so it was a Latin translation of the Old Testament. And so when they use that and they see the word Lucifer, instead of translating it into English as day star, they just put the word there, Lucifer, and then made it a proper name for whatever reason, right? It is just a mistranslation, as simple as that. Or you could say, it's capitalized, so it's a mistranslation. Or you could just say, for whatever reason, they put the Latin word for day star. It still means day star in English, right? And so it's not necessarily about Satan. Now, the reason I say that I flounder, when we get to Ezekiel 28, I still don't think that's about Satan. However, there are some who will say this is not about Satan, but that is about Satan. It's the same thing, though. It's a taunt against the king of Tyre. And so it sounds very much similar, but it has a lot of parts that don't seem to fit. And so what some scholars will say is that basically the fall of these people, or these kings, they're being characterized in the same language that would be used for the fall of Satan. In other words, the fall of Satan is being used to characterize the fall of these human kings. The only problem with that is there's no other context for that. There's no other place that it explains the fall of Satan. Now, do we believe Satan fell? Yeah, because we get in the New Testament, in Luke, Jesus says, I was seeing Satan fall like lightning. So we're not saying that there's not a fall, but we're saying, is this really about that? In the context that it's written, nothing about this says that it has anything to do with anybody other than the king of Babylon, right? So where do we get the fall of Satan then? Well, we don't. As far as we don't get the story of it, we don't know how it happened. We just know that it happened, right? That's the point. We don't get the story that we want, because that's what we want to know, right? We want to know, well, why did he fall? And why did he do this? And why did he do that? Well, we don't really know those things, right? Unless this happens to be somehow characterizing the fall of Satan. But I don't see it personally. But there are certainly others who will somehow compare it.
Yeah, but who cares? It doesn't change anything whether it is or it isn't.
It ultimately does not change anything, except many people will build a theology of the fall of Satan on those two passages, right? And they'll use those two passages as definitive, like a backstory.
Yeah, but to what end?
I don't know, just so they have,
so they can say they're right.
or there's more information. Just it's like Jesus, right?
My point is, because sometimes we get so wrapped up in some,
Absolutely.
for instance, the theory, the doctrine of election.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So
Yeah.
people get so dogmatic on it that they lose context. Perception.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I absolutely would agree with you. Yeah. It's kind of like, Jesus as a child, right? Would be such a fascinating story, right? And right after the time of Jesus in the 2nd and 3rd century, clearly the early church was fascinated because they wrote several stories about it, right? Which aren't biblical, and they're made up stories. But clearly people wanted to know. Well, Satan's an interesting figure that people want to know more about. And so it's like, oh, this sounds like Satan, even though I'm ripping it out of its context.
But there's
to
nothing
make it
about Satan in both the Old and New Testament to identify what he's about and what his purpose is.
Agreed.
Separate us from God.
Yeah, but we just never get the fall. Like, why is he that way?
Right.
Why is he the way he is? I guess that's the question. So why is he like that, right? Yeah. And again, it is just that. It's just the desire to know, right? I mean, it's not, yes, ultimately it does not affect the theology of Satan at all, ever. It's just, it would either add or not add to the story.
It is preached that way, though, and taught that way.
Yeah, and again, I'm not saying that there's not an actual fall of Satan. Revelation 12 talks about the fall of Satan, but it talks about the fall of Satan as in falling at the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, where he loses access to heaven, which we talked about here in the past, right? So then you get, and we talked about Job and Zechariah 3 and all of that. And so you say, well, so he's clearly there fulfilling a purpose, right? Even again, when you get to the New Testament, it says the Holy Spirit leads Jesus out to be tempted by Satan in the wilderness, right? So again, he's still doing what God tells him to do, through the Holy Spirit in that deal. So it is an interesting thing. But again, yes, it does not change ultimately. Satan's still evil in the end, right? And he's still against God's people and all of that. So, okay, Hezekiah's reforms. Note that he repairs and cleanses the temple, right, which had been long overdue. He reinstitutes the temple sacrificial system. They celebrate Passover, even though they celebrate it late. But they figure, you know what? God appreciates the fact that we're celebrating it. This is actually not in what y'all have read yet. I think you'll read this Saturday, but just, you'll have it as you get there. They celebrate Passover. The pagan structures and stuff are removed, the Asherahs and the pagan worship places and such. And note that Hezekiah will eventually, he'll seek independence from Assyria, which will get them in trouble in Judah. However, God will protect them, right, from the Assyrians, and he will allow them to survive past that. And then, because they're coming through Israel, and they're going to come on through Judah. And we've already gotten where God was basically like, yeah, it's going to happen. You're both going to be gone. And then because of Hezekiah, he says, I will give you a reprieve, right? And so so you get that. But then, of course, in 586, so from 722, they get a reprieve to 586. And then the Babylonians come in, and because they turn again away from God. Okay. And then listen, this is one of my little pet things, as a musician. Right. 2 Chronicles 29, 25 through 28. This is during those reforms, right? Okay, so again. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, lyres, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king seer, and Nathan the prophet. For the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with trumpets. Then Hezekiah commanded that the burnt offering be offered on the altar. And when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord began also, and the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Note again, they are using musical instruments at the temple when we're reestablishing the sacrificial. So like this is a holy time, and we have instruments, right? Now I'm not saying that you should have like rock, music or whatever, but I'm just saying that for denominations who say you can't have musical instruments in worship that is such a legalistic view. And again, to be fair, let me explain again why. They think if in the New Testament, if something is not specifically stated as okay in the New Testament, we don't want to do it because we don't want to accidentally do something wrong. But again, you've got all of this in the Old Testament where clearly it's okay. You've got people or beings worshiping God in his throne room in the book of Revelation with musical instruments. I'm going to say it's okay, right? I'm going to say that the Bible says that it's okay, right? I mean, I don't think we're stumbling into anything there, right? Now, again, and I'm not saying that, whatever, sometimes it may get a little too far, right? If you got rock concerts going on and the point becomes the rock concert and not the worship of God, that's a different problem, right? That's not because of the instruments. That's a heart issue. Like that's a whatever, selfishness or pride or whatever that is, right?
This goes with the Bible.
Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.